Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Heidi McAnally-Linz, and I am the Director of Policy and External Relations for IPA. And you're here for our webinar From Research to Policy in School Management and Accountability. And we're going to share some evidence from a few randomized evaluations. And we're really excited that you're all here. Just quickly, we will have a Q&A at the end. There are a lot of people on the webinar, so we probably won't be able to answer everything, but if you would like to ask a question, and we've received some questions in advance, you should feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom, and we'll kind of watch those throughout and spend some time on Q&A towards the end and answer as many as possible. Also, the webinar is going to be recorded and available later. So if you miss anything or if you want to see the slides, we'll share that with you later. So don't worry about it, just enjoy and feel free to engage in the question and answer. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm really excited to have here today with us Sarah Kebe, who's IPA's Education Program Director. She's going to tell us about a program in Uganda, and Adrian Lucas, who's an Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Delaware, who's going to talk about a program in Ghana, and Juan Manuel Hernandez Agramonte, who's the Country Director for Peru, Bolivia, and Paraguay, and is going to talk about a program that we've done in collaboration with the Ministry of Education in Peru as well. So just a real quick note about IPA. If you're here, you probably know who we are, but we're an organization that's committed to discovering and advancing what works to reduce poverty. Ultimately, our goal is to improve lives. As we're well known for, you can go to the next slide. We do employ a rigorous method for randomized evaluations that's been quite well recognized globally, and we support hundreds of researchers, including those that recently won the Nobel Prize in Economics, to do that research. Next slide. But while we're known for RCTs, and that's critically the kind of core of what we do, we're an organization that's about making sure that lives are actually improved and changed as a result of RCTs. So we are more than just RCTs. We are built on 3 pillars to create stronger evidence, and you're going to see some examples of how we do that today through some co-creation of evidence with policymakers, through kind of some improvements in how, kind of constant improvements in how we do the research. And then we share evidence strategically to the right people at the right time, both in global forums like this, as well as in really kind of intimate one-on-one conversations in smaller groups with policymakers and practitioners. And then finally, we equip, back to the slide. Finally, we equip decision makers to use that evidence. And you're going to hear about 2 examples today that actually have come out of really long-term partnerships with ministries of education, where we have been working to support governments and their development partners to actually use and even create evidence themselves. So finally, today we're going to talk about education, but obviously IPA does this across sectors and across countries, and we've been doing it for many years and have over 850 evaluations to date, working with hundreds of partners and various researchers. And so if you want to learn more about a number of areas, we're here. And then finally, just in light of COVID-19, the global pandemic, I wanted to highlight that IPA has a program called the Research for Effective COVID-19 Responses, or RECOVER. Our RECOVER program is IPA's response to COVID-19 and the critical need for data and evidence that there is right now. And so far we've already deployed over 20 rapid response surveys to answer critical policy questions around the globe across topics, including one core survey, multi-country panel survey that we're doing. We've developed and are launching over 90 studies to generate rigorous evidence around the world, in collaboration with many of the people you're going to hear from today, as well as various others. And we're also working across governments that we have existing partnerships with, as well as a lot of our peers, to share information and resources and data. And I think of potential interest to this audience is that we are going to have a webinar, a RECOVER webinar series coming soon. This is not part of that series just yet, but stay tuned for more, and we'll still try to kind of address some of those topics today in our Q&A as well. Next slide. So now to the webinar. you're here because you want to know a little bit more about how educators and policymakers and researchers can work together to produce research that actually helps improve school management, accountability, and ultimately learning. And so, like I said, Sarah is going to talk about a participatory school scorecard program in Uganda, where local actors were trained to monitor issues and use a scorecard. And Adrian's going to talk about a program in Ghana that aimed to help teachers and circuit supervisors and managers improve implementation of a targeted instruction program. And Juan's going to talk about a program in Peru that we worked on together with the government to send nudges to principals to improve use of management. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Sarah, who's going to get going. Sarah.
Oops, sorry, I was muted there. Great, thank you so much, Heidi. So I'm just going to start by quickly outlining my presentation for today. So I'm going to highlight some key findings, then discuss some of the background to this work. And the research that I've been working on builds off the results of a previous study, what I'll refer to as the original study, which was conducted by Barr and colleagues. So I'll describe that pretty quickly. And then discuss the present study. I'm really excited that I'm able to share some results from a phone survey that we've been conducting during this time of school closures, but just finished last week. So I'll do that and then offer some quick conclusions. So this research shows that engaging local stakeholders in their management of primary schools can improve educational outcomes, but that maybe we don't really understand exactly how these interventions are working. So this research is really focused on that key concern, how to unpack these different interventions, better understand their theory of change so that we can think about their potential, especially looking towards sustainability and scale. And then finally, this work supports some other research that's been done to show that community monitoring interventions can help improve emergency response. So community monitoring interventions have been implemented in a number of different sectors: health, politics, and education. They're used to address a number of different issues as well. But one of the core ideas is moving away from a national centralized focus. So here on the left, we have the Ministry of Education in Uganda, and towards the school, right? And there's a key idea that local level stakeholders might be in a uniquely advantageous position to monitor public services. This is part of the broader field of school-based management, right? And I just want to highlight that this is a huge field of work. This is one of the most popular educational reforms of the half century. And as a good illustration of that, we can see that in just 6 years, the World Bank devoted $1.7 billion to school-based management reforms. But there's still a lot of work to better understand and investigate these different interventions. And just to give you, sort of a high-level summary here, this has been going on for a very long time, right? So here we have a review from over 20 years ago, looking at 82 different school-based management studies in the United States. You can see the results of these studies are very mixed, whether these interventions are effective. And then here we have a much more recent review looking at school-based management in low and middle income countries. But again, the results are similarly mixed. Right? So that's really the goal of the research here, is to better understand how and why certain interventions do or do not work, and unpacking the theory of change and mechanisms of impact here. So that's why this original study gets us a great opportunity. So Barr's research team evaluated a primary school scorecard program. Right? So this is a very popular intervention within the field of community monitoring interventions. Right? And so the way it works is that community members elect representatives to monitor issues at the school. They document those issues on a scorecard, and they share that scorecard with key stakeholders. And the original study had 2 different treatment variations, right? And so these were exactly the same in all respects, except for the way in which items were selected to be included on the scorecard. Right? So in the standard treatment, the researchers, NGO, the government, they worked together to determine a sort of best practice scorecard, the issues that they thought would be most useful for schools to monitor. And then in the participatory treatment, the community members elected the issues themselves. So each school decided what issues they wanted to include on their scorecard, what issues they wanted to monitor at their school. So looking at the results, the participatory scorecard was really successful, right? So it reduced student and teacher absenteeism, it improved test scores. The standard scorecard had smaller and statistically insignificant results, right? So these are 2 variations of the same intervention, right? So a key question is why? Like, why was one variation so much more successful than the other? So just to return to some of the theory behind these interventions, here we have a pretty standard theory of change for how community monitoring interventions work. So this is from Westhorpe's review of community accountability interventions in education in low and middle income countries. And I just want to highlight the last 3 steps in this chain, right? But it's community members report data, right? So they monitor issues, they report that information, some level of authority responds to that information and acts on it, and then those relevant actors then are sort of affected by that action and respond accordingly. But to return to the results of the scorecard, so the participatory scorecard we see was effective in improving student-teacher attendance. But for the most part, participatory schools weren't monitoring those issues. And conversely, in the standard scorecard, all standard schools were monitoring both teacher and pupil attendance because that was included on the standard scorecard. But there wasn't an effect on those. So you can see there seems to be some key breakdown here in our understanding of these interventions and the theory of change between monitoring specific issues and those issues responding to that process. But luckily, the original study included this behavioral game component, right? So behavioral games are experiments to model decision-making or behavior. So rather than just asking somebody what they might do in a hypothetical situation, you have a respondent play a game with real money, so there are actual stakes, to see how they actually decide and behave. And so this particular study was looking at the voluntary contributions mechanism, which is intending to measure willingness to invest in the public good or collective action, right? So each member of the scorecard has the choice during this game to either choose the personal account, in which case they would get 5,000 shillings and 1,000 shillings for every other person that, or every person that contributes to the school account, or choosing the school account. And then they get 1,000 shillings for everyone who chooses the school account. And this is seen, though the investment, the choice to choose the school account is seen to be investment in the public good. In the original study, they saw that the members of the scorecard in the participatory scorecard treatment were much more likely to choose the school account. Right? And so they used this to sort of theorize about, it was something happening in the participatory process that better enabled the community to discuss school goals, constraints, progress, right? So something around collective action or something qualitatively happening at the school was really the driving mechanism of change behind this intervention. And so that's the starting point for our current research, right? So Elevate Partners in Education is an NGO working in Ugandan primary schools. I've been collaborating with them for several years, and they saw the results of this study and comparing the participatory scorecard intervention to other interventions in the Ugandan context and similar contexts. This is the most cost-effective intervention for improving educational outcomes. So they really wanted to focus on the participatory scorecard and try and unpack this mechanism of change and understanding how it works to be able to determine its potential for sustainability and scale, right? So thinking about partnerships with ministries, and Uganda is in the process of refining its school management committee policy. And so this is a real opportunity to think about the potential of this intervention moving forward. So working together on this research, we had a number of different goals, right? So we wanted to better understand, what does collective action mean in the Ugandan context? We wanted to unpack how this intervention is working. And then finally, because this is implemented, almost 10 years later in a different part of Uganda, we wanted to see, well, would we observe the same impacts that we saw in the original study? And so these questions roughly translate to the 3 different components of our work today. Because we're short on time, I'm going to just blitz through these, but we have a working paper available, and I'm sure we'll be able to share a lot of this information moving forward. So just to quickly summarize some results from the impact assessment, we didn't see any impact on teacher-student attendance. But one thing that happened is, we know from our partnership with the district education office where we are working, that there's a broad reform at improving teacher attendance over time. And so we just saw general improvement between the baseline and the end line, and that just wasn't related to the scorecard. But we did see a decrease in dropout rates, right? So in schools that received the participatory scorecard, there was much lower levels of dropout. This is really important because you can see this study took place over just 2 years. You can see that in the control schools, almost 10% of kids drop out of school. So this is a serious concern for Ugandan primary education. We also saw a decrease in school transfer. And then we saw, as I mentioned, we played the same behavioral game. We saw an increase in the likelihood of teachers choosing the school account. So just one caution, there are a number of significant differences between the original study and this study. That's just, I can't get into that complexity right now, but it's a really interesting discussion. And we're also really thankful that original research team were very supportive of this work and shared a lot of their resources and documents to be able to use in this study. But just moving on quickly to some of the other work that we were doing to unpack and understand what is collective action. We conducted a lot of qualitative interviews as part of this work. And in some cases, people actually use this language to describe the scorecard, right? So here we have a quote from an interview with the school management committee chairperson, one of the participatory schools. And we see he's saying that the scorecard program emphasizes collective effort, right? It's aligning different stakeholders together, this idea of one voice coming from these disparate stakeholders. Another thing we did was played the same behavioral game from the original study. And what we wanted to see was, well, what was associated with choosing the school account? So for all the different actors that played the game, we asked them a number of questions, and we saw that only 2 were correlated with choosing the school account. So individuals who disagreed with the following 2 statements were more likely to choose the school account, right? So this potential willingness to invest in the public good or collective action seems associated with these 2 statements. So you can see they're both focused on this idea of blame or potential tension or disconnect between 2 different stakeholders. And this ended up being really reinforced in our qualitative research. So this idea that the scorecard program moves the community away from the blame game, away from finger pointing, it's really important in aligning different stakeholders to work together. So we completed that research in 2019, but then enter the global pandemic and school closures. And so we were concerned and interested in what was going on at schools. So wanted to check in with the schools we've been working with and also potentially see, did schools that have the participatory scorecard respond differently than schools that didn't? So over the past couple of weeks, we've conducted a phone survey with head teachers, asking a number of different questions. So their understanding of the coronavirus, their response to the school closures, their feelings about the current situation. When we asked them a series of questions, so following a traditional Likert scale, right, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And just some of the initial results that we've seen, we have some exciting preliminary findings. I'm just going to share a couple. So in response to the question, if I were to talk to members of my community about the coronavirus, they will trust me and believe what I have to say. So head teachers that were in the treatment, so that received the participatory scorecard the past couple of years, were much more likely to strongly agree with this statement. Similarly, I believe as a head teacher in this community, I have a special role to play in a situation like this. Again, we see head teachers with the participatory scorecard are much more likely to strongly agree with this statement. So just to quickly conclude, right, we see that community monitoring interventions really can improve educational outcomes, but we're still in the process of understanding exactly how they work, what might need to be maintained if this were to be scaled or continued across multiple contexts. But that the participatory process we seem to be really important. Right, so aligning different stakeholders towards a shared goal, moving away from finger pointing or blaming, and this really aligns with an important narrative within Ugandan primary education policy and the way that policy has been communicated and how it shares responsibility across multiple stakeholders. And finally, this supports other research done on the Ebola epidemic and other contexts about how community monitoring interventions can help build more resilient systems in education and elsewhere. So great, thank you so much.
Great. Adrian, you can take over the screen sharing.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining us. This project I'm going to talk about is thinking about taking successful interventions to scale, the importance of managers. This program is joint with Sabrine Begg and Ann Fitzpatrick. So what we're going to think about, the motivation for this project is something I think probably a lot of us on this call have seen. Is that children are in school, but they're not learning. And so once children fall behind, they just can't catch up. And what that means is with social promotion, learners of many learning levels are all in the same grade. And a single teacher is trying to teach to all of these learners who are in all different places in their educational journey in the same classroom. We're going to be working in Ghana, but this is not a uniquely Ghanaian problem by any stretch of the imagination. And so what we want to think about is we want to think about a solution that is government implemented, scalable, and works within existing government systems. So to give you an idea of what we're going to find in this study is we're going to do an RCT, a randomized control trial of teacher-led targeted instruction in Ghana. And I'll say more about that in a second. But just to get you interested, right, student learning increased about a third of a year of school in only one school year. Teachers implemented the program. Head teachers, which in this context are principals or school leaders, and circuit supervisors conducted longer, more useful classroom observations. And what we're going to think about is we're going to think about specifically training managers in one arm and not training managers in another. And we're going to find the same thing with and without the specific management training. So why did we do teacher-led targeted instruction? Well, first of all, let me tell you a little about teacher-led targeted instruction. Teacher-led targeted instruction, the idea behind it is that teachers teach a subset of students that are, or teachers teach students at their grade level, at their learning level instead of their grade level for part of each day. So what this means is in practice, we're going to be in upper primary grades. So in grades 4 through 6, teachers are going to teach, they're going to divide their students by learning level. So at the beginning of each term, they're going to test their students, figure out which learning levels they are in. And then for 1 hour each day, 4 days a week, 8 weeks per term. They're going to teach the students at these learning levels by dividing students by learning level instead of class. So we're going to have students in learning levels 1, 2, 3 instead of students in grade levels 4, 5, and 6. Now, this was previously shown to be to improve student test scores in India under some very specific circumstances. So there was help from NGO, a non-governmental organization in India, and they had a new instructional hour in which to implement it. This was previously tested in Ghana, and it marginally improved student learning, but there were some really large issues of implementation where teachers were not undertaking this dividing students by learning levels as often as they should have been. So what we're going to think about using the managers of these teachers to be catalysts for change and improve the likelihood that teachers implement this targeted instruction program. And this is relevant well beyond the education sector, as we have growing evidence from small-scale RCTs of what can work to improve other outcomes, and we need to think about embedding those in existing government systems. So the program that I'm going to talk about the evaluation of is the STARS program, which is strengthening teacher accountability to reach all students. Some really important piece of this is that it worked within existing government systems. This was government owned from the start. The Ministry of Education, UNICEF, and IPA were the three kind of pillars of the program. We used existing Ministry of Education structures and personnel from the very beginning, from the developing the materials all the way through teaching, training the teachers. So we didn't just take this on faith. This is going to be a program that works well. We're thinking about taking something to successful to scale within existing systems, and so we're going to test it. And we test it with a 3-armed randomized control trial in 210 schools to learn about scaling successful programs within existing systems. So in the first arm, we trained the teachers in targeted instruction, meaning we helped them learn how to test their students, evaluate what learning level they were in, engage in active pedagogy with that learning level, as well as have some course materials. The second piece of the intervention had new forms for managers, their head teachers, to observe their lessons. And these forms included this most salient parts of targeted instruction. So are the students divided by learning level? Is this student-centered active pedagogy? And the final piece of this is that there was national monitoring teams from the agencies within the Ministry of Education that observed schools and visited them each term. We didn't honestly think that was going to be as successful as it possibly could be. And one of the reasons we thought that there might be some room for improvement is we thought maybe teachers may be hesitant to undertake this new form of pedagogy, but we thought maybe training the managers, so their head teachers and circuit supervisors. So circuit supervisors are in charge of observing about 8 to 10 geographically proximate schools. And they're really a conduit between the schools and the district education offices. And so in the second treatment, we trained both the head teachers, so the school principals or school leaders, and circuit supervisors in how to better support teachers and become more like managers, mentors, and not really enforcers, but all work together to improve the student learning experience. So that was in addition to what the treatment 1 got. And in the final arm, which was the control group, we had, they got none of these treatments. And this was implemented across 20 districts throughout Ghana. The specific questions we're going to ask in our RCT is, does teacher-led targeted instruction improve student learning in upper primary grades? Can the additional training of teachers' managers increase the fidelity of implementation, increase the likelihood that teachers actually undertake this intervention? And then does that increase test scores? And finally, it's much easier to engage teachers than it might be to engage school managers. And so we're going to think about the additional costs and logistics of engaging managers, and we're still undertaking some of the analysis on this. Data collection happened during the 2018-2019 school year. We're going to have a baseline achievement test. We're going to have 2 spot checks where we basically check to see are teachers doing the program as intended, who's teacher present, head teacher present, student presence, and then finally we're going to have a follow-up achievement exam at the end of the school year. The results. Let me take a second to kind of walk you through what these results are going to look like, because each slide is going to look similar. So if you see along the horizontal axis, this is the different tests that we gave. These gray bars are the learning that happened in the control group. The green bar is what happened in the targeted instruction only arm, and the blue bar is what happened in the targeted instruction plus management arm. So what you're going to see here is that achievement increases across both treatments. The first 3 bars are on foundational content, which means this is the basic literacy and numeracy. And it increased about 15% of a standard deviation. And if you compare that to the size of the gray bar, it's about half the size of the gray bar. So we increased student knowledge on foundational content by about half of a school year during the intervention. If we come over here to all skills, this includes grade level content. It's going to include student comprehension in reading, for example, that wouldn't be considered in foundational skills. And so we increased these scores by about 11% of a standard deviation, or about a third of a score. Compare the green and blue bars to the side of the gray bars. One other thing you should notice here is that these black error bars tell you that basically the 2 interventions had the same statistical effect size, even though some of the point values and the foundational skills are larger for the TI plus management arm. We also looked at implementation. How well are teachers implementing the program? And what you see is about 60% of the time, teachers are dividing the students by learning level instead of grade level during spot checks. And the second thing that we improved is that teachers were more likely to be present in the classroom during these spot checks by about 12 percentage points off of a base of about 68%. These are our preliminary estimates of what's going on in the management improvement. So these are classroom observations. These are teacher reported. As you can see across both head teachers and circuit supervisors, both of those managers were more likely to observe a classroom lesson for more than 30 minutes. And they were also more likely to provide useful feedback when they did observe those classes. So our discussion, we'll say a few minutes on this. The treatments improve the outcome, but it's statistically the same across the 2 treatment arms. So what's going on with that? So we think 2 things, or at least 2 things are going on. One, we think these national level monitors were really important. So teams from the national level of GES, NTC, NACA. So what these people are is this is the Ghana Education Service, the National Teaching Commission, Curriculum, Inspectorate Board, and Basic Education Division monitored about 88% of schools. So each school is 88% of treatment schools were visited each term. This was a strong signal to the teachers. This is a government program. It also provided some accountability by involving the district education office. Second thing we think really improved the implementation of this relative to the previous intervention is this classroom observation checklist. And it really hit on the most salient features of targeted instruction. And this occurred in both arms. And we're digging into more to learn better about management practices and if any of those changed. So in conclusion, teacher-led targeted instruction increased student test scores equally across both treatments by about a third of a year of learning. And this is about, if you think about the previous study that I referenced at the beginning in Ghana, this is 40% more than the previous intervention in half the time. Teachers implemented the program. Head teachers in CS were more likely to spend time in teachers' classrooms and provided more useful feedback. And national level monitors provided additional supervision and accountability. Just a big thank you to everyone involved in the study. Of course, we had tremendous implementing partners in the ministry and UNICEF. We had very generous evaluation funders, and of course, the entire IPA Ghana team. Unfortunately, I'm out of time, but these are some really important people in the study. And finally, we're working on a working paper. And the best way to make sure you see the working paper is to follow us on Twitter or certainly be in touch through email or other means. So I think now I'm going to throw it over to Juan, who's going to talk about Peru.
Thanks, Adrian. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to present a work that I did together with Angel Deston from the University of Vanderbilt and Stanislao Maldonado from the University of Rosario. So there are 3 main takeaways from this study. The first one is that we find supportive evidence about the role of behavioral-based non-monetary incentives as a tool to increase compliance among civil servants. The second one is that context matters for the optimal design of this type of incentives. And the third one is that this is a flexible and low-cost strategy to address the principal agent problems when the state capacity is low. So governments invest millions of dollars on public policy. How effective is this investment depends on many factors. One of them is the quality of civil servants. So it's important to ask how we can improve civil servant capacity especially in a context where the state capacity is low and the cost of enforcement of contract is high. There are many ways to answer this question. No? We can go and try to recruit better civil servants, but this is not always possible. We may lack of the right human capital in specific areas. We could also use monetary incentives, which has been well researched, but this is expensive to take it at scale. We know less about non-monetary incentives for civil servants, especially those ones that are rooted in behavioral economics. So this study, what wants to answer is the following question. Can non-monetary incentives based on behavioral insights increase the capacity of the state to improve civil servants' performance compliance at the scale? In order to answer this question, we designed a text message campaign with behavioral content. And we implemented and evaluated in 3 different RCTs in partnership with 2 nationwide social programs. The first experiment was done in 2015 with the Ministry of Education of Peru, and we call this one the benchmark experiment. The second experiments were done with the Ministry of Education in 2016 and with CUNA-MAS also in 2016. So let's focus on the first experiment, the benchmark experiment. This one focused on a national program of education infrastructure called PRONIET of the Ministry of Education. And the program consists on transferring funds to schools for maintenance work. How it works is that principals files plans of how they want to do the maintenance work to the central government. The central government evaluates those plans and transfer money to the national bank accounts. Principals then implement the maintenance activities. They withdraw cash and they spend this cash. And finally, they have to file expense reports on how they did spend this cash, and they have to send invoices and pictures of the work. So there are some serious compliance gaps in this program. First, there are incomplete bank account withdrawals. Not all the funds were executed, which means that potentially not all the planned work is completed. Second is that the expenditure reports, all the expenditure reports are not filed, so the government doesn't know what happened with the money. There is no quality control and accountability. So as I mentioned, we designed this text message campaign that had the following characteristics. It consists of 5 text messages that were sent during a period of time of 3 months. Messages were targeting principals on specific activities, to file the plan, to withdraw the funding, to file the expense report. And we use behavioral tools for all the messages. So all the messages included personalized messages, exogenous deadlines, and we have a variation of 5 different behavioral contents. You can see on this graph on the left, the different behavioral contents. So the first one were reminders about the activity that should be done. The second one, called monitoring, was a feedback on the level of compliance of each principal. Social norm was information about the level of compliance of their peers, of other principals. Shaming was the information about a publication of a list of those that are not complying. Auditing threat was a text message making salient the fact that at some point the Ministry of Education will audit them. The sample size for this experiment is 24,000 principals across the national level. This is a large-scale experiment, and these 24,000 principals were randomly assigned to one of these 5 groups of treatments, and also to a control group that didn't receive any text message. So to measure outcomes, we use a combination of administrative data and primary data. And we're gonna focus on a main outcome, on the spend report as our main outcome. This is because the spend report implies that the previous activities have been done. Nevertheless, we find similar results to the ones I'm going to present for the other outcomes as well. So in this graph, you can see the main result of this experiment. The first thing to note is that all the different treatments have a significant effect on the probability of complying. If you look at the first bar, the green bar, that's the average effect for receiving any type of message. So receiving any type of message increased by 3.9 percentage points the probability of complying, and this is significant at the 1% level. And the others, and this translates into a reduction of 15% of the compliance gap. The other thing to notice is that social norm and monitoring have the higher coefficients in terms of effect. Nevertheless, we cannot yet reject that all these treatments are have similar effects. So, meaning that all the messages have a similar effect. An interesting result comes from the replication we did with the Ministry of Education in 2016. In this experiment, what we did was to work with the same sample, but we randomized principals stratifying by the previous experiment assignment. So we have principals that in 2015 were in the control group and in 2016 are in the treatment group. And those, the results for those principals are in the green bar. We have principals that in 2015 were in the treatment group, but in 2016 they were in the control group. And you can see the results in the blue bar. And in the red bar, we can see principals that in 2015 and 2016 were in the treatment group. And the first interesting thing to notice is that there is no evidence of fatigue, meaning that perhaps the effect of this campaign rely on the surprise effect. No, it's the first time you receive this type of messages, so you are surprised and you want to comply. And nevertheless, if you look at the red bar, we can see that those principals that were treated twice, like in 2 years consecutively, they have a positive treatment effect of 2.5 percentage points. And this effect is similar to those principals that received the treatment in 2016 for the first time, which is the green bar. Another interesting result is that there is no persistence, meaning that once you stop receiving the treatment, the effect fades away. So you can see that the blue bar for those principals that received the treatment in 2015, but didn't receive the treatment in 2016, the effect is almost zero. And another interesting finding is the replication that we did with CUNAMAS, which is the Early Childhood Development Program of Peru. And we call this the external validity experiment, as we replicate the same text message campaign with case managers of the program CUNAMAS. Case managers that are expected that every month they submit a report on their household visits. So we implement a similar campaign. This time we were sending them 3 text messages because they have a cycle of a monthly cycle to submit these reports. So we focus on this month with the 3 text messages. And we only used 2 treatments in this case, the monitoring and the social norm treatment, which were the ones with the highest coefficient. Nevertheless, they were not different from the rest of the treatment. And we see something very interesting. Here on the right side, you can see the graph summarizing the result. And you will notice that the monitoring treatment arm had a large effect of 6.4 percentage points, significant at the 1% level. And social norm have an increase on the probability of compliance of 2.35, but this increase is not statistically significant. So basically, we see that there is an effect on the monitoring treatment, but not on the social norm treatment. And this is interesting because in the Ministry of Education case, both treatments have an effect. So our hypothesis is that the context may interact with this treatment in a different way. So in the case of the Ministry of Education, contracts are long-term. Principals work for the Ministry of Education most of their life, and they cannot be fired. In the case of CUNAMAS, contracts are low tenure, and these civil servants can be fired. And actually, the turnover for this position is really high. The average length of the contract is less than a year. So this may interact with the social norm treatment, which is based on what you think about your peers. So if you don't care so much about your peers, this treatment may not be effective. So just to conclude, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is evidence that supports the role of behavioral-based non-monetary incentive as a tool to increase compliance among civil servants. It's a very low-cost strategy to address principal agents' problems. We The only cost involved is the text messaging cost and the programming time. And nevertheless, context matters for optimal design of messages. So if you want to use this methodology, you may want to do some A/B testing to get the right design. And finally, these results were used by the Ministry of Education to scale up this policy to the national level. And now these 24 schools receive annually this type of campaign to increase the probability of compliance. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks Juan and Adrian and Sarah, and you guys can all turn your video on now so we can see everyone. So we've got a lot of questions. We're going to try to get to as many as we can in the next 17 minutes, and we'll follow up if we can't. We'll share afterwards. So I'm going to start with specific questions for each of you that have come in, and then we'll go to a couple for the whole panel before we conclude. So Sarah, the first one's for you. Could you say a bit more about the amount of time and investment required for the participatory program, and how much external support and training did it require? I think as we're thinking about it from kind of a policy perspective, that's a really important question to understand.
Great, yeah, and this is definitely something we've been thinking about from the beginning and that we've been intentionally investigating, that I think also really relates to Adrian's work, in that in Uganda, there's a sort of equivalent position to circuit supervisors that are called central coordinating tutors. And that was the way that the intervention was originally implemented, but we saw that they were given additional funding and support, like a transport stipend and other things, to make sure that they were able to visit the schools. And we've seen in other research too that these positions often tend to go to whichever NGO might be paying them at that time. So we experimented a little bit with who would be this individual to train. But another thing we've been thinking about is whether the scorecard intervention should be directly integrated into a school management committee, or whether it should be a standalone intervention, right? And so a lot of those questions relate to the questions of dosage and the intensity with which we engage. But Elevate has been experimenting with this even after the end of this study. So I'll definitely follow up and talk to you about how they've been changing their design, and the idea of an intense first year, a scale back in the second year, and a third year that is a very light touch. But one of the things that's very encouraging just from the results of this research was, as I mentioned, the intervention Elevate's direct engagement with schools ended at the very end of 2018, right? And so we just finished collecting data at the beginning of 2019. And so this recent phone survey that we just did a couple weeks ago shows that something at least is persisting, potentially even without the direct involvement of Elevate over the past couple of years. So we've got more details about that we're very excited to share moving forward.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And Adrian, I think relatedly, could you talk a little bit about whether or not the people who gave the training and provided support were the technical staff in the system whose job it was to provide that support and training in the absence of the intervention? And also maybe you could talk a little bit about, from a policy perspective, how realistic this kind of central level monitoring that we think is important is at scale, and if not, how should we think about that at scale?
Yeah, those are great questions. Thanks. So we added exactly one person to the system. We added Kevin. So Kevin was the guy who manned the help desk, but other than that, like soup to nuts, it was government. So from the designing of the materials to then the national level, so NACA, which is the curriculum side, they developed the materials, they trained master trainers who are already in the system who are supposed to do periodic training of teachers. And they trained so NACA trains master trainers trains the trainers train the teachers, and these are all within the government system except for Kevin, who manned the help desk. And then the second question was, what do we think of national monitors, and how do we think of that at scale? Because we really can't take these national monitors out of their national level posts and have them visiting schools. So I think this is a great open question. So was it really that the national monitors were there monitoring, or was it really a signal that this is a serious program being taken seriously by the government? So one of the things we heard from teachers coming into this program was, I'm told to do something different every year. Someone walks in and says, do this, and then I do it. And then the next year they say, don't do that, do something completely different. So it's really hard at this point to disentangle the importance of just the signal that, no, this is serious, this is the ministry, we really want you to do this, we're not going to tell you next year to do something else, right? We really emphasize in the research as well, this was going to inform a potential scale up of this, and this is being integrated into the broader reform of the national curriculum. So I think that is a question, you know, is it a signal of government ownership or was it actually the presence of these people? And we have some qualitative work in the field that we're trying to understand that. So maybe, I guess is the short answer.
Great, thanks. And then one for you, there's kind of a specific question about to the extent to which this improvement that you're talking about made a real difference in terms of overall compliance and how you think about that and how the ministry is thinking about that as well.
Yes. So we are talking about behavioral-based incentives, non-monetary behavioral-based incentives sent by text messages. So we are talking about a very low touch, cheap intervention. And the type of effects you get from this type of interventions are typically of a magnitude of 2 to 5 percentage points increase in compliance. So this is within the expected range. And I agree that it might not be a huge increase over the control average, which is already high. Nevertheless, if you take in account the proportions of this experiment and you put in context this result, the returns are quite substantial. So this program has an annual funding of $200 million per year. And just by sending these text messages, we were able to increase by 1 million the amount of money that is reported to the government. So this $1 million, usually the government doesn't know what happened with this money, but because of these text messages, we were able to increase the file of these expense reports and therefore the accountability of this money. And this is an investment of $2,000. So with $2,000, you can treat 24,000 principals with 5 text messages across 1 year and get a 1 million return on non-reported funding. So yeah, it's a small increase from the average of the control group, but when you put it in proportions of the funding that this program manages, it's a quite substantial increase so you get like for every 3 cents of dollar, you have a return of $300, about $300 of additional funding reported.
Awesome, thanks, Juan. And I think kind of just to throw it back to the panel, one of the related questions that comes up for me is, you know, as we think about the effectiveness of teacher training in the absence of better school management and incentive structures, what do we know about that? Adrian, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we can kind of compare what we saw in the previous study in TCAI, is colloquially known as TCAI, versus what we're seeing now. And in the first one, it was, if you're not familiar with that study, this teacher-led targeted instruction was one of 4 different models that was tested. And managers or head teachers were not engaged at all. And so I think at that level, you know, there wasn't even a revised, here's how you observe a classroom form. And I think in that setting, there was very low take-up. So there was increase in student learning, but there was very, very low take-up. And so personally, I was surprised at how high the take-up was, because in that study it's about 5%, and now we're seeing about 60%. So there is something to engaging the managers, whether it's, you know, a form or whether it's specifically training them in targeted instruction, you know, having them go through the same training. And then we need to think more about, from our study at least, what did it mean, this additional management training? And are we picking that up in other places? What I showed you today, the effects are the same, whether we engage the managers or not. But in both just the kind of TI alone, there was at least some manager engagement.
That's great. Juan or Sarah, do you want to comment, or should I move to the next? Great. So maybe I'll just turn a little bit to the world in which we're all living in now and ask a couple questions about how this all applies in a COVID world. So first, are there any learnings that come out of this that you think might be more applicable, especially in the new virtual management world that we are currently in?
So I think one of the things we have been seeing in the region, in Latin America, is that ministries of education usually rely on local level management structures and face-to-face strategies to monitor and to record indicators of compliance. And now during the COVID situation, that's not possible anymore. And whether there is some technology constraints that may have prevented these governments to deploy this type of strategies, now it is evident that we need to close this digital divide and start thinking on monitoring strategies that can be applied remotely and allow us to register whether a process is being fulfilled or not in a remote way, no? And I think this research that I presented is relevant in the current situation in which we don't have this technology and we need to rely on phones. We need to rely mainly on, and therefore understanding how we can leverage this communication channel and deploy low-cost incentives, non-monetary incentives through these channels could help us to increase the compliance with the national education remote education programs that the Ministry of Education are deploying. And we are also thinking not only just restricting to the actors of the system in terms of principals and teachers, but also to parents. No, we can think on how to leverage this type of incentives to increase parental investment during this COVID situation.
Which I think is related a bit to some of what Sarah's work has been on. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to speak to this at all.
Yeah, definitely. I think, just one issue that I think is important that we often overlook, is just the importance of these different relationships and how little we understand, so for example, what is an average district education officer's day like? What's the average central coordinator's day like? What are their relationships? Are they very, sort of punitive and supervisory, and they don't have a very close collaborative, relationship with the teachers and schools that they monitor? Similar between head teachers and school management committees. Like education systems include a lot of different actors. And I think in emergency response, what's really important is that there's trust, that there's ways to communicate, right? And that we focus on relationship building there to enable, quick moving, course corrects to be able to respond to a very, very challenging situation. And then I think another sort of interesting issue that we've been thinking about, is how to capitalize on some of those natural networks, right? So teachers are on WhatsApp chains, head teachers have a sub-county group for, like understanding what are these, organic forms of communication and trust and relationship building, and how do we design interventions to support those and enable those. And then one interesting thing I think too is to consider, different Ministry of Education's responses about, a top-down directive, or in more, sort of when a school can be more autonomous, they're able to pivot and change and design different responses themselves. And then just thinking about it, I think one of the key challenges for this remote situation is understanding whether and how to involve different actors, right? So we've seen a lot of different settings. Teachers are completely sidelined right now. And that definitely has to do with, some of the challenges related to what technology are available and things like that. But I think moving forward, to consider the whole ecosystem and all the different actors, and then have interventions that are building on these relationships and understanding the importance of relationships and communication and alignment and trust.
Yeah, and I think that's all related to the last question. So maybe Adrian, you can answer both together when you answer. So as we think about kind of a potential return to school and in some places where they already are, what is the work that you've been presenting today, and what does management and accountability evidence kind of mean for us in a post-COVID world?
Yeah, so I think the idea of targeted instruction, right, that's going to become more important as students have been missing out on learning, but some have not, right? So at least in Ghana, there's been this, tele courses that have happened, but not all students have access to a television, certainly. So when students come back to school, these gaps within a grade level might be even larger. And so we really need to think about how can we engage learners of all levels. And the evidence from targeted instruction is that's certainly a way in which you can engage learners at all learning levels.
Yeah, one other thing just to build on that too, I think, sort of mentioned by Adrian, that we might understand kids right now are having very different experiences, right? Some more affluent kids with parents who have more of an educational background, right, might be having one experience, and children who are coming from situations where those resources aren't present, are going to be having. So this idea of inequality growing, I think this is really important because I think we all intuitively know how important parents are, and yet so many educational interventions are really focused on the classroom and put parents and community very second as a sort of, afterthought. And I think this situation just shows, even in the best of times, children spend the majority of their waking hours outside of school, right? And so really how to think about parents as key, important, if not the most important partners in our work in education. And that's, just my previous point about relationships too, are parents intimidated by the teacher? Do they feel trust to the teacher? Are they skeptical of the head teacher? Like all these things are that much more important now when we're really relying on parents so much to, sort of manage what's going on. And then we understand that, the resources and existing levels of inequality, we think will only be magnified, moving forward.
Juan, did you want to add anything before we wrap up?
No, just to underline the last point of Sarah, in this COVID context, the role of parents are becoming more important, and many work is being done in the region on how to interact with parents. No? So I think in the coming months we will learn better how to do this.
Yeah, and with that, I think many of us also are parents that are interacting with teachers as we speak on this panel, as well as in the audience. So we'll let you all get back to that in time and to your other calls, but thanks so much for joining us. And just as a little bit of a preview to some of the other work that we'll share in a couple of weeks, hopefully, we've been doing some of this data collection on what's happening in Latin America, in Ghana, and starting in Uganda as well. And so hopefully we'll share some of that in light of the pandemic in a few weeks. So stay tuned, and we look forward to having you back soon. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.